life, the universe, and gathering berries, a bedtime story. Chapter 1. The curious case of the alarm clock that hadn't been invented yet, and why this is probably a good thing. Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the early Upper Paleolithic, there exists a small, unregarded rock shelter where on any given morning roughly 40,000 years ago, a perfectly ordinary Homo sapiens would wake up without the slightest trace of existential dread. This was not because life was simple. Life was in fact quite complicated, full of saber-toothed tigers, unpredictable weather, and the constant nagging suspicion that the berries you just ate might have been the ones that make your insides attempt to leave your body at high speed. No, the reason there was no existential dread was far more profound. There was no alarm clock. Imagine, if you will, waking up without any mechanical device screaming at you that the universe has decided it's time to be productive. No buzzing, no beeping, no gentle chimes pretending to be friendly while secretly judging your life choices. Just the soft grey light of dawn filtering into a simple rock shelter, like a particularly polite guest who doesn't want to wake you too abruptly. The air is cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of last night's wood smoke and the rich, earthy smell of the ground itself, the sort of smell that modern marketing departments would call heritage and charge you extra for in a candle. Somewhere nearby you can hear the low murmur of voices as the rest of your small, slightly smelly band begins to stir. A baby cries briefly, realizes it's still 40,000 years too early for existentialism, and goes back to sleep. Someone laughs softly. Outside, birds are calling to each other in the growing light, probably discussing the weather or the latest gossip about which mammoth herd had moved on without saying goodbye. This, dear reader, is how humans woke up every single morning for hundreds of thousands of years. This was morning. It is roughly 40,000 years ago. Give or take a few thousand years, because timekeeping was still in its experimental phase and nobody had invented the concept of being fashionably late yet. You are a Homo sapiens, living somewhere in what we would today call Europe or Africa or Asia, depending on which way the wind was blowing and how lost your ancestors had got on their way out of Africa. Anatomically, you are identical to any modern human. Same brain size, same body proportions, same deep capacity for language, complex thought, and wondering why your neighbor keeps stealing your favorite flint scraper. The only real difference is that your daily reality is so completely different from ours that trying to imagine it is like trying to explain the concept of taxes to a particularly philosophical squid. So here is the question that still keeps archaeologists and anthropologists awake at night, which is ironic given the subject matter. What did you actually do all day? We all carry this very specific image in our heads, carefully cultivated by countless movies and documentaries. We picture brutish, hairy figures constantly running from saber-toothed tigers, spending every waking moment in a desperate search for the next meal, always on the very edge of starvation, living lives that were nasty brutish. In short, basically one long nightmare of hardship and constant terror, occasionally interrupted by the invention of fire and the occasional really good berry. That is the picture most of us grew up with, right? Except that picture is almost completely wrong. In fact, it is so wrong that if it were a map, it would proudly declare, "Here be dragons," right in the middle of downtown Paris, and then charge you for the privilege. The archaeological evidence that has been carefully dug up over decades tells a radically different and far more beautiful story. Early humans were not just barely surviving from one day to the next. They were truly living. They had rich social lives full of connection and warmth. They had genuine leisure time. They had art, music, spiritual practices, and a wonderful sense of humor, probably including the world's first dad jokes about mammoth sizes. They sat together around fires, telling stories late into the night. They decorated their bodies with paint and ornaments. They carved intricate little figurines and painted absolutely breathtaking images deep inside cave walls. They took care of their elderly and their injured members with real compassion. They buried their dead with ceremony and placed grave goods beside them. They had culture. Complex, sophisticated culture that we are only now beginning to understand and appreciate in all its depth. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. Before we reach the cave paintings and the ritual burials, we need to understand the simple basics first. What did a typical day actually look like for our ancestors when there were no jobs to commute to, no bills to pay, no grocery stores to run to? When the very idea of survival meant something entirely different from what it means for us in the modern world. The truth, as the guide would put it, is going to surprise you in the best possible way. Early humans probably worked less than most of us do today. When anthropologists have lived with modern hunter-gatherer societies, which give us the closest living window into prehistoric lifestyles, they have found that adults typically spend only 4 to 6 hours a day on what we would call subsistence activities, gathering food, hunting when the opportunity was right, preparing meals, maintaining tools and shelters. That was it. The rest of the time was leisure, time spent socializing, playing, creating art, telling stories, or simply being together in each other's company. This completely turns upside down the story we have always been told about progress. We like to imagine our ancestors as desperately poor in both time and resources, while we are the lucky ones living in comfort and abundance. But when it comes to genuine free time, the opposite may actually be true. A person living 40,000 years ago probably enjoyed more hours of real leisure in a single week than most of us get in an entire month. If you are listening to this right now to help you fall asleep, that is exactly why these videos exist. So settle in, get comfortable, breathe slowly, and let the story carry you wherever it will. Maybe, when you wake up tomorrow, you could leave a comment telling me where in the world you are right now and what time it is. I read every single one, and it always fascinates me. There is someone in Tokyo watching the sunrise, someone in London on their lunch break, someone in California drifting off at midnight, all falling gently asleep to the same shared human story. It feels almost suspiciously magical. The more we study prehistoric life, the more complex and nuanced the picture becomes. Yes, there were real dangers. Injuries were common and often serious without modern medicine. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. Infections that we would treat with a single course of antibiotics could be deadly. Life expectancy at birth was lower than today, though not nearly as low as many people assume. If you survived childhood, you had a very good chance of reaching your 50s or 60s, and some individuals lived much longer still. But what truly matters is this: within the years they had, people lived full, rich lives. They laughed, they loved, they mourned, they created, they struggled, they celebrated. They were not simply biological machines fighting for survival. They were fully human in every sense that we understand that word today. They needed food and shelter, of course, but they also needed connection, meaning, beauty, and play. Exactly the same fundamental needs we still have, even if we now express them through slightly more complicated spreadsheets. So come with me now. Let us walk through one ordinary day together. Not a dramatic day filled with a mammoth hunt or a clash with a rival group, though those days certainly happen too. Just a regular, quiet day. 40,000 years ago, when an early human opened their eyes to the dawn and lived their life in ways that feel both utterly foreign and strangely familiar to our own lives today. Because understanding how our ancestors actually spent their hours does more than teach us about the past. It gently raises uncomfortable questions about the present, about how we live now, about what we have gained with civilization and what we may have quietly lost along the way, about whether progress always means what we think it means, or, to put it another way, don't panic. Let us start at the very beginning with that gentle moment when the grey light of dawn filters into the rock shelter and another prehistoric day quietly begins. Chapter 2. The remarkable incident of waking up without any sense of impending doom. You are not yanked out of sleep by any alarm. There are no alarms at all. There is no concept of being late for anything, no schedule that must be kept, no one waiting for you to appear at a certain time or place, and most importantly, no glowing rectangle on your nightstand, silently screaming that the universe has already started without you. Instead, awareness returns slowly and naturally, drawn out by the gradual lightening of the sky and the soft, familiar sounds of the other bodies stirring around you inside the shelter. This is, one might argue, a vastly superior system. The first thing you feel is the morning chill. It is not the bone-deep, life-threatening cold of the deepest winter, though that certainly has its own brochure, but that fresh, crisp edge that makes you want to stay curled a little longer beneath the warmth of the piled hides and dried grasses. You are lying close to the others in your band, not necessarily out of any particular romantic inclination, but because shared body heat is a resource too precious to waste in the cool dawn air. In fact, it is one of the few things in life that is both free and genuinely useful. The second thing you notice is the scent. Wood smoke. Always wood smoke, though it is faint now because the fire that burned brightly through the night has settled into glowing embers. Mingled with it are the honest smells of living human bodies, the faint trace of rendered animal fat from yesterday's meal, and the clean mineral breath of the rock shelter itself. If your camp is near the coast, you might catch the tang of salt in the air. If you are inland during spring, the green scent of new growth rising from the earth. None of this is unpleasant. It is simply what the world smelled like before someone decided to invent air fresheners that smell like ocean breeze, but are actually just chemicals pretending to have been near the sea. Someone is already awake. There is always someone awake. Sleep in the Paleolithic was often biphasic or even polyphasic. People would sleep for several hours after full dark, then wake for a period in the middle of the night. This was not insomnia. It was completely normal. During those quiet, wakeful hours, they might talk in low voices, tend the fire, check on the children, share intimacy, or simply lie still with their thoughts while the world outside remained silent and dark. Because someone was usually awake, the band was never entirely unguarded. Someone was always listening for any sound that did not belong. The careful footfall of a predator, the snap of a twig, the distant howl that meant danger was moving through the territory. Safety was not something you took for granted. It was something you protected together, hour by hour, through vigilance and quiet cooperation. Which, when you think about it, is a rather more elegant system than relying on a night watchman and a strongly worded sign. Right now, that person is feeding the fire. You hear the soft rustle of movement and then the sudden bright flare as fresh wood catches. Fire management may have been the single most important skill your people possessed. If the fire ever died completely, restarting it meant either walking miles to borrow embers from another band or using friction methods that were exhausting and time-consuming. So, the fire was never left alone. The duty of tending it through the night passed gently between people, often to the elders who slept more lightly anyway and had already earned their place in countless other ways, sometimes to young adults without small children. Sometimes simply rotating in quiet understanding that everyone contributed to the survival of the whole. This was, in its own quiet way, the world's first successful example of distributed responsibility, and it worked rather better than most modern committee meetings. As the flames grow stronger and the light inside the shelter brightens, more people begin to wake. The children are always first. They wake full of morning energy, ready to move and play, just as children do in every age. You hear a small voice, the soft rustling of bodies, a mother's gentle murmur telling the little one to stay close, stay warm, wait for the sun. But children have never been good at waiting. Within minutes, several of the older ones are up, stretching, moving toward the growing fire, their breath visible in the cool air. The adults rise more slowly. There is no rush at all. This is important to understand. The entire modern idea of hurrying, of being pressed for time, simply did not exist. Your day was shaped by light, by hunger, by weather, by season. The sun is only just beginning to paint the eastern sky with soft greys and pinks. You have hours before anything particular needs to be done. Right now, the most important thing is moving from sleep to wakefulness without wasting any of the precious calories you will need for whatever the day brings. So people stretch slowly and carefully, working the stiffness out of muscles that slept on the ground. They yawn, scratch, attend to basic bodily needs. If you are in a rock shelter, there is a designated area for waste, far enough away to stay clean, but close enough to remain safe. In a temporary camp, people simply walk a short distance into the surrounding bushes. Someone, usually one of the more experienced members of the band, steps just outside the sleeping area to read the morning world. Not out of paranoia, but out of careful attention. What changed during the night? Are there new tracks near the camp? How is the weather moving? Is that cloud bank in the west bringing rain or simply passing through? Has the wind shifted, carrying new scents and new information from the wider landscape? This morning, reading of signs was something Paleolithic humans did with a skill we can barely imagine today. They could tell from the behavior of birds whether a predator was nearby. They could predict weather days in advance by watching clouds, feeling humidity, noticing how different plants reacted. They could look at a single track and tell you exactly when the animal had passed, whether it was healthy or hurt, traveling alone or with a herd. All of this information was quietly shared as more people gathered around the growing fire. Conversation begins softly, then gradually builds as the whole group consciousness comes awake. Dreams are often spoken about. The line between dreaming and waking reality was not sharply drawn. A vivid dream might be understood as a message, a warning, or a visit from ancestors, something worth discussing and considering carefully. Plans for the day begin to form, but always loosely. The band needs food. That is always true. But the real question is what kind and where to look for it today. Someone noticed yesterday that certain berry bushes were almost ripe. Someone else saw fresh signs of a large animal moving through a nearby valley. A third person suggests checking the fishing spots if the camp is near water. None of these are commands. There is no single leader in the way we usually imagine. Decisions rise naturally from conversation, from shared knowledge, from people choosing to follow whoever has the most experience with that particular task. But that is still ahead. For these early morning moments, the main activity is simply being together again. Your small band, your extended family and survival circle is reassembling after the night's separation. Everyone made it through another period of darkness and vulnerability. Everyone is present and accounted for. There is deep comfort in that. Safety came from numbers, yes, but also from something even deeper. The fundamental human need for one another. We evolved to feel most alive in connection. Those who found joy in closeness, who drew strength from kin, who thrived on cooperation, they were the ones who survived the hard times. Their descendants, us, still carry genes that make solitude feel wrong and community feel like home. The children are playing now, their energy catching and spreading. Their games have no rules yet, just running, chasing, tumbling, wrestling. The kind of physical play that builds strength, balance, and coordination. The adults watch with half an eye, letting the young ones be young, but ready to step in if play grows too rough or anyone wanders too far from safety. Meanwhile, small, practical things are quietly taken care of. Someone checks the tools yesterday. Is the spare point still firmly attached? Did the carrying basket develop any weak spots that need mending? Is there enough cordage for today, or should someone spend time making more? These tasks are not chores in the modern sense. They do not feel like things you must finish before you can do what you really want. They are simply part of living, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. And through all of this, there is no sense of pressure. The sun is higher now. The morning chill is lifting. You have probably been awake for an hour, though you have no way to measure it and no reason to care. Your stomach is beginning to remind you it is empty. Others are feeling the same. Soon the focus will turn toward food. But not yet. For now you are warm, you are safe, you are surrounded by people who know you and whose survival is tied to yours. This is waking up in the Paleolithic, slow, communal, guided by light and bodies and the ancient rhythms that shaped human life for hundreds of thousands of years. Those rhythms are still inside us. That gentle desire to linger in bed, to ease into the day rather than attack it. That is not laziness. That is your ancient brain, remembering how mornings once felt, back when time belonged only to the sun and there was always enough of it. Chapter 3. On the curious absence of breakfast and the general philosophy of eating, whenever one felt like it. Except your ancestors 40,000 years ago did not have breakfast. Not in the way we think of it today. They did not wake at a fixed hour, stumble half asleep toward a kitchen, and pour themselves a bowl of anything. They did not have set meal times at all. Not really. They ate when food was there, when hunger quietly demanded it, when the opportunity simply presented itself. This might sound loose or even chaotic to our modern ears, but it was perfectly tuned to the world they lived in, a world that had not yet invented the concept of scheduled sustenance or the existential dread of missing the 7:42 a.m. porridge window. Picture yourself waking in that rock shelter as the first true light begins to filter through the entrance. Your stomach gives a low growl. You are hungry, so you eat. It is as straightforward and natural as that. No meal plans, no calorie counters, no guilt. Just hunger and food having a brief, civilized conversation about whether they should get together right now. What you reach for depends entirely on what yesterday left behind. Perhaps there are still strips of meat from the red deer the hunters brought down 2 days earlier. It has been hanging in the cool, shaded back of the shelter, carefully wrapped in the animal's own hide and away from direct sunlight. The crisp autumn air has kept it from spoiling, though it is starting to develop that rich, slightly gamey scent that tells you it should be finished today. You pull off a piece and chew it slowly. It is tough and requires real work from your jaw, but it is packed with protein and fat, exactly what your body needs after a night of sleep. Your teeth are strong and your jaw muscles powerful. When scientists study the wear patterns on Paleolithic skulls, they see clear evidence of a lifetime spent processing tough foods. Which is to say, your ancestors had excellent jaws and probably never needed to see a dentist who would lecture them about flossing. But here is what is even more fascinating. Those same teeth carry microscopic traces of something else. Plant residues, starch grains from roots and tubers, tiny silica bodies from seeds and nuts. Your ancestors were not living on meat alone. They were eating everything the land offered, like particularly enthusiastic omnivores who had not yet been told that certain food groups were in or out this season. Beside the meat sits a simple wooden bowl. Really, just a section of bark folded and sealed with pine resin, filled with hazelnuts gathered 3 days ago. You crack a few between your strong back molars, using the exact technique that has been passed down through generations. Children watch adults do this from the time they can sit up, learning the precise angle and pressure needed to free the sweet meat inside without crushing it. This was, one might argue, the world's first practical STEM education. Next to the nuts is a soft leather pouch containing dried blackberries. They were picked during the late summer abundance and spread in the sun to dry. Now they are wrinkled and dark, their sweetness concentrated into small bursts of energy. You take a handful, and the sugar reaches your system almost immediately, giving you a quick lift. The sort of lift that modern energy bars spend millions trying to replicate, usually with less success and more packaging. But the real treasure this morning is the basket of roots resting near the embers. Someone, probably one of the older women who carries decades of plant knowledge in her hands and her memory, dug these up yesterday from the soft soil along the riverbank. They are cattail roots, starchy and nourishing, but tough and basically inedible if eaten raw, so they were placed close to the fire the night before, not directly in the flames, just near enough that the gentle, steady heat has been slowly breaking down the fibers and turning complex starches into sugars your body can use. This is cooking, but not the kind you know. There are no recipes, no precise temperatures, no timers, only knowledge accumulated across thousands of generations about exactly what fire does to different foods, which, when you think about it, is rather more impressive than most modern cookbooks. The roots have been sitting there all night, slowly roasting in the residual warmth from the fire that is never allowed to go out completely. By morning, they are soft enough to eat and sweet enough to enjoy. You pull one out carefully, blowing on your fingers so you do not burn them. It is hot, but manageable. You peel away the outer layer and bite into the flesh. It is not what we would call delicious by modern standards, but it is filling and, more importantly, it is safe. Raw, those same roots contain compounds that would give you a nasty stomachache for days. Cooked, they become reliable, life-sustaining food. This everyday transformation, turning plants into safe nourishment through fire, may have been one of the single most important technological breakthroughs in all of human history. It effectively doubled or tripled the number of plant species your ancestors could eat. Tubers that were toxic when raw became everyday staples once roasted. Seeds that would have passed straight through the digestive system unchanged became valuable nutrition once ground and heated. It was, in its quiet way, the culinary equivalent of discovering that the answer to life, the universe, and everything was not 42, but apply heat. The evidence for this incredible dietary variety comes from many different sources. Fossilized feces, coprolites, have been found at archaeological sites across Europe and Africa. When scientists examine them under powerful microscopes, they find an astonishing range of plant remains. Seeds from dozens of different species, pollen from flowers, microscopic fragments of leaves, roots, and even bark. Some coprolites also show clear traces of insects, grasshoppers, beetle larvae, termites. These might seem unappealing to modern Western tastes, but they are excellent sources of protein and fat. Many living hunter-gatherer societies still consider certain insects delicacies, and there is no reason to think your ancestors felt any differently. After all, when you're 40,000 years from the invention of the deep-fat fryer, you take your protein where you can find it. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque that builds up on teeth, tells the same rich story. When archaeologists carefully scrape it from Paleolithic skulls and study it under high-powered microscopes, they find plant starches from across the spectrum, wild grains, root vegetables, nuts, berries. and even plant fibers that were probably chewed to extract moisture or to soften them for other uses. What all of this evidence paints is a picture of remarkable dietary flexibility. Your ancestors were not specialized in any one food source. They were opportunists, able to make use of virtually anything their environment offered. This was not greed. This was survival with style. Coastal groups ate fish, shellfish, seaweed, seabirds, and sea mammals, supplementing them with whatever plants grew near the shore. Inland forest dwellers ate deer, wild boar, nuts, berries, roots, and mushrooms. Groups living near rivers ate fish, waterfowl, aquatic plants, and the land animals that came down to drink. This flexibility was not a luxury. It was the key to survival. Environments change. Seasons shift. Animal migrations follow patterns that can be unpredictable. A group that could eat only one or two types of food would starve when those resources grew scarce. But a group that could eat 50 different things would almost always find something. Which is, when you think about it, a rather more sensible approach to life than insisting that Tuesday is strictly Paleo Day. As you eat your morning meal, everyone else is doing the same. The young mother is sharing nuts with her toddler, patiently showing him how to crack the shells and pick out the meat without getting fragments in his mouth. His small hands still lack the strength and coordination, but he is learning, and in a few short years he will be teaching his own younger brothers and sisters. Knowledge transfer, Paleolithic edition. The old woman is preparing something more complex. She has taken some of the leftover meat and is pounding it between two stones, mixing it thoroughly with rendered fat and the dried berries. She is making pemmican. Though she would not call it by that name, it is simply food that lasts, concentrated nutrition that can be carried on long journeys or stored for the lean times ahead. The ratio of meat to fat to berries has to be exactly right, or it will spoil. The pounding has to be thorough, or the mixture will not bind together properly. This is precise technical knowledge passed from her mother, who learned it from hers. A chain of transmission stretching back thousands of generations. Quite possibly the world's oldest family recipe, and remarkably free of pretentious Instagram captions. No one eats alone. That almost never happens. Food is social. It is shared. It is distributed according to complex rules that everyone understands without needing to speak them aloud. The hunter who made the kill yesterday is not eating any more than anyone else. In fact, he may be eating a little less because that is how the system works. You give when you have, so that when your luck turns, others will give to you. This is insurance. This is risk pooling. This is the social glue that keeps the entire band together. It is also, one might note, a significantly more reliable system than most modern pension plans. Children dart back and forth between adults, stealing playful bites, getting gently swatted away, or having food pressed into their hands. No one is stingy with the children. There is always enough to go around. And if there is not quite enough, the adults eat less, so the young ones are fed first. This was considered basic decency, not a radical political statement. The meal itself is informal and unceremonious. People eat standing up, sitting down, walking around, checking tools, talking, laughing. Yet it serves crucial social purposes all the same. Everyone is together, reinforcing bonds, sharing the small details of the day ahead. Who will go gathering plants today? Who will try for the deer? Who will stay behind to finish working on that deer hide? These decisions emerge organically from conversation and quiet consensus rather than from any command. Which is to say, it worked rather better than most modern team meetings. Someone mentions that the hazelnut trees by the northern grove should be producing well right now. Several women and older children immediately volunteer to check them. Someone else notes the fresh deer tracks seen near the river yesterday. The hunters exchange glances and nod, already beginning to prepare mentally for a possible pursuit. Even while the conversation flows, hands stay busy. Someone is grinding seeds between two stones. Someone else is sorting through dried herbs, setting aside any that show the slightest sign of mold. A teenager is carefully learning to use a sharp flint flake to slice thin strips of meat, laying them out to dry. These skills are vital, and they are learned entirely through watching and doing. There are no written recipes, no formal lessons. Children observe the adults, try to imitate, receive gentle corrections, and try again. By the time they reach adulthood, they carry an encyclopedic knowledge of food, which plants are edible, and when, how to identify them in every season, where to find them, how to process them safely, how to store them for later. This body of knowledge is staggering. Ethnographic studies of living hunter-gatherer societies show that they typically hold detailed information about 200 to 300 different plant species. They know which parts can be eaten, which need special preparation, which have medicinal uses, which are toxic, and which can be used for cordage or arrow poison. Your ancestors almost certainly carried the same vast living library. They had to. Their survival depended on getting it right every single time. Eat the wrong mushroom and you die. Fail to prepare certain roots correctly, and you spend the next 3 days doubled over with cramps. This was not casual knowledge. This was life and death information, carefully preserved and handed down across countless generations. Quite possibly the world's first and most effective form of crowd-sourced survival data. As the morning meal winds down, a few more sticks are added to the fire. The embers are never allowed to die out completely if someone is paying attention. Fire is too valuable and too difficult to restart from nothing. Someone is always responsible for tending it, and the duty moves quietly from person to person. The meal was not elaborate, but it was adequate. Everyone has eaten something. Bellies are reasonably full, energy levels are restored enough for whatever the day will bring. And that is really all that matters. Your ancestors were not gourmets in the modern sense, but they understood nutrition in a deep, intuitive way. They knew that variety across days and weeks was more important than perfection at any single meal. They knew different foods brought different strengths to the body. They ate to live, but they also lived to eat. Food was pleasure even when it was simple. The satisfying crack of a perfectly opened nut, the burst of sweetness from sun-dried berries, the rich, warm fattiness of bone marrow slowly roasted in the coals. These were not merely calories, they were experiences, shared moments that connected people to the land and to one another. And now, with morning fully arrived and stomachs satisfied, it is time to turn to the day's real work. The main activities are about to begin. Chapter 4, in which our ancestors discover that walking around looking at plants is surprisingly effective for not dying. Here is something almost no one ever tells you about life in the deep past, probably because it lacks the dramatic soundtrack and slow-motion running sequences that Hollywood finds so irresistible. The hunt gets all the glory. The thunderous chases after mammoths, the coordinated takedowns of deer, the tense face-offs with predators that look excellent on a cave wall, and even better in a movie trailer. Those are the moments that end up in museums and on screen. But here is the truth that would have been obvious to anyone actually living 40,000 years ago. Hunting was the exception, not the rule. Gathering was the everyday reality that kept everyone alive. On any ordinary day, somewhere between 60 and 80% of the calories your band consumed came from plants. Roots, tubers, nuts, seeds, berries, leaves, flowers. The exact percentage shifted with the seasons and the landscape, because nature, unlike modern diet books, refused to stick to one rigid plan. Groups living near the coast might get more protein from shellfish. Communities in colder northern regions might lean more heavily on meat during the long winters. But for most human groups, most of the time, plants were what quietly kept the band fed and strong. This was not because your ancestors particularly loved vegetables, though they would have been delighted by the modern concept of superfoods and the marketing budgets attached to them. It was simple evolutionary math. A successful hunt could provide enough meat to feed the entire band for several days, but hunts failed far more often than they succeeded. Animals are fast, unpredictable, and dangerous. They require hours of careful tracking, perfect coordination, and more than a little luck. Plants, on the other hand, stay exactly where you left them. They grow in patterns that anyone with enough knowledge could learn to read. So, while a handful of hunters might be out hoping for glory, the majority of your band was doing the real steady work of survival, walking the landscape with practiced eyes, reading signs that would be invisible to anyone untrained, collecting the foods that would actually end up on tonight's fire. For decades, anthropologists told a neat, simple story about prehistoric gender roles. Men hunted, women gathered. It was presented as natural, almost inevitable, perhaps even hardwired by some cosmic HR department. But the evidence tells a more nuanced and practical story. Yes, in many groups, women and older children did most of the gathering while men specialized in hunting. But not in every group, and not always. Archaeological sites have revealed women buried with hunting weapons. Isotope analysis of ancient bones shows that some women ate diets as meat-heavy as any male hunter. Some bands practiced communal hunting where everyone took part. Others had expert gatherers of both sexes who spend their entire lives perfecting their knowledge of plants. The truth is probably this: prehistoric societies were deeply pragmatic. They organized labor in whatever way made the most sense for their specific environment, their needs, and the season. In some bands, women who were pregnant or nursing focused more on gathering because it was compatible with carrying infants. In others, women past their childbearing years became some of the most valuable hunters precisely because they no longer had those physical constraints. The important point is this: never imagine gathering as lesser or less prestigious work. It was specialist knowledge that required years of training, and it kept the entire band alive day after day. Which, when you think about it, is rather more important than looking impressive while waving a spear. So picture yourself on a gathering expedition. It is mid-morning now. The sun has been up for a few hours and has already burned off the last of the morning mist. You are heading out with 3 other people. Your mother's sister, who knows the locations of every useful plant better than anyone else in the band, a skill that modern botanists would kill for, or at least write several very long papers about. A younger cousin, maybe 11 years old, who is still learning the roots and the knowledge, and your own 3-year-old child, sleeping peacefully in a sling made from carefully softened deer hide strapped against your back. You are not wandering aimlessly. You are following a mental map that has been built up over years of close observation and memory. The oak grove 3 miles to the north should have acorns ready for collection right now. The patch of wild onions near the creek will be past their prime, but just beyond it stands a rich bed of cattails where you can dig the starchy roots. If you are lucky, you might find a beehive heavy with honey. If you are very lucky, a few birds' eggs. The universe, it seemed, occasionally provided. The walk itself is no casual stroll. You will cover somewhere between 5 and 10 miles today, most of it over terrain that would challenge even experienced modern hikers. Rocky hillsides, thick underbrush, streams to ford, slopes to climb. And you are doing all of this while carrying a child, plus the tools of your trade, a fire-hardened digging stick worn smooth from years of use. Several baskets woven from plant fibers and nested neatly inside one another. A leather pouch for smaller finds, and perhaps a sharp stone knife tucked into a belt made from twisted plant fibers. But here is what makes gathering so different from hunting. It is not about adrenaline or sudden drama. It is about deep, quiet attention. You are reading the landscape like an open book, noticing details that would be completely invisible to an outsider. The slight discoloration of the soil that tells you edible tubers are growing just beneath the surface. The pattern of animal tracks that suggests a fruit tree is nearby. The specific angle of sunlight that reveals which side of the hill will hold the ripest berries today. Your aunt stops at what looks, to you, like an unremarkable patch of ground. But she sees something you are still learning to recognize, a particular type of grass that almost always grows near the edible roots she is looking for. She drives her digging stick into the earth, probing carefully. 3 inches down, she strikes something solid. She works the stick around it, loosening the soil, then reaches in with her hands and pulls up a tuber the size of your fist. It is pale and knobby, completely unappealing to look at. But you know from experience that when it is roasted tonight in the coals of the fire, it will be sweet and filling. She hands it to you. You place it carefully in your basket. She digs again, another tuber, and another. This spot is rich. In 10 minutes you have collected enough to feed the whole band tonight, with some left over for tomorrow. But you are not done. Your aunt knows these plants by heart. More importantly, she knows their stories. The stories are how the knowledge is remembered and passed on. She tells your young cousin about the time her own grandmother became terribly sick after eating a root that looked almost exactly like this one, but had slightly different leaves. She points out the distinction: 3 veins in the leaf instead of 5. That tiny difference is the difference between life and death. The other plant would shut down your breathing within hours. This is education, but nothing like sitting in a classroom. It is survival knowledge passed through stories told while the actual plant is in your hands, demonstrated in real time, reinforced through years of direct observation. Your cousin will learn hundreds of these lessons. By the time she is your age, she will know perhaps 300 different plant species by sight, by season, by exact location. She will know which ones are safe to eat, which ones are medicinal, which ones will kill you. She will know when to harvest each one, how to prepare it safely, and what else it can be used for. Modern botanists spend years in university learning to identify plants. Your ancestors learned the same body of knowledge through necessity, beginning in early childhood, because getting it wrong could mean death, which is, one must admit, a rather more compelling motivation than final exams. The group moves on. You wade through a shallow stream, the cold water shocking against your legs. On the far bank, your aunt spots something that makes her smile. Mushrooms growing out of a fallen log. She approaches carefully, examines them from every angle, even smells them closely. Mushrooms are tricky teachers. Some are nutritious and delicious. Others cause violent illness. A few will kill you. She picks 3 she is certain about and leaves the rest. Caution is always wise, especially when the alternative is becoming a cautionary tale. Hours pass in this gentle, steady rhythm, walking, observing, collecting. The baby on your back has fallen asleep, lulled by the motion. Your baskets are growing heavier. Wild grapes, still a little tart but perfectly edible. Seeds from a certain grass that you will grind into flour back at camp. Bark from a specific tree that, when boiled, makes a tea that reduces fever. Your aunt collects this last one with great care, never taking so much that she damages the tree. She learned long ago that you must always think about next season, next year, the generations coming after you. This is sustainable harvesting. Your ancestors did not have a word for it, but they understood the principle deeply. If you strip a plant bare, it will not be there when you need it again. The bands that learned this lesson survived. The ones that did not faced starvation when resources ran out. Nature, it turns out, has very strong opinions about greed. By early afternoon, you are several miles from camp. Your legs are tired. Your shoulders ache from the weight of the full baskets. The baby has woken and is fussing, wanting to be fed. But there is a deep, quiet satisfaction in the work. This is good work. Important work. The kind that keeps everyone alive. When you return to camp, there will be no fanfare. No one will celebrate your arrival the way they celebrate a successful hunt, but everyone understands the reality. The hunters might come back empty-handed tonight. They often do. But you have brought food. Reliable, nutritious, life-sustaining food. And tomorrow you will go out and do it all over again. This is the steady rhythm that sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years. Not the dramatic moments, but the patient, knowledgeable, day after day work of gathering. Your ancestors were reading the landscape in ways we have almost completely forgotten. They were paying attention to nature with an intensity that most modern humans never experience. And they were doing it not as a hobby or a spiritual practice, but as the fundamental daily work of staying alive. Chapter 5. The Art of Persistence. Hunting, or how to tire out a perfectly respectable antelope over several hours. Here is something that might genuinely surprise you, in the same way that discovering the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42 can be surprising. Mostly because it feels like it should have been something more complicated. Your ancestor was probably not hunting today, or yesterday, and quite possibly not even this week. We have been given a very dramatic picture of prehistoric life, carefully cultivated by Hollywood and various documentaries that seem to believe the entire Pleistocene was one long action sequence scored by dramatic orchestral stabs. We imagine early humans waking up each morning and immediately heading out to chase down mammoths or wrestle saber-toothed cats in daily life or death battles for survival. Man versus beast. Non-stop adrenaline. Constant danger. The sort of thing that looks excellent on a big screen and sells popcorn. But the reality was far more interesting and far more thoughtful. Hunting for your people was not an everyday grind. It was an occasional, high-stakes event that required immense planning, patience, skill, and, more often than not, ended in failure. A successful hunt might happen every few days when everything aligned perfectly. It might happen only every few weeks when conditions were less favorable. The rest of the time, the band relied on the steady, reliable work of gathering while the hunters prepared weapons, scouted, repaired gear, and waited for the right moment. When that right moment did arrive, it was extraordinary. Let us say today is one of those days. The signs have been building for a while. Yesterday, scouts spotted fresh tracks from a small herd of antelope moving through a valley about 5 miles from camp. The animals are heading toward a seasonal water source, following patterns your people have observed and remembered for generations. The timing feels right. The weather is clear and calm. And most importantly, several experienced hunters are available and healthy enough to make the attempt. This is how a hunt begins. Not with sudden impulse or reckless excitement, but with careful, deliberate discussion. The group gathers in the early morning light, 6 men and 2 women, all proven trackers and hunters. They talk through the plan using a rich combination of spoken words and hand signals that have been refined and passed down over thousands of years. Who will take which position? Where are the animals likely to move if they bolt? What are the fallback options if the chase does not go as hoped? They carry spears that are masterpieces of prehistoric engineering, each one taking days to create. The wooden shafts were carefully straightened over fire and seasoned for months to prevent warping. The stone points were knapped from high-quality flint that was traded from a quarry 200 miles away. They are hafted with plant resin and sinew that has been processed and dried until the bond is stronger than most modern adhesives. Some of the hunters also carry atlatls, spear throwers that use leverage to triple the velocity and distance of a thrown spear. This technology is relatively new in your region, perhaps only a few thousand years old, but it is already transforming the way hunts are carried out, much as the bow will revolutionize everything thousands of years from now. One could almost call it progress, if one were feeling generous. The group sets out, and immediately you notice something important. They are not rushing. There is no frantic sprint across the savannah, no desperate chase. Instead, they walk at a steady, sustainable pace, reading the landscape as they go. This is where hunting becomes a true science, rather than the sort of thing that ends with someone being dramatically eaten. One of the trackers kneels beside a clear depression in the sandy soil. He studies it for several long moments, then signals quietly to the others. The track is fresh, probably from this morning. The depth and clarity tell him the animal was moving at a calm walk, not alarmed. The spacing between tracks shows it is a young adult, healthy, good size, but not too large to bring down safely. He can read all of this from a single hoof print. This is not magic. It is pattern recognition honed over a lifetime of careful observation. Your people have been learning to track animals since they were children, reading the land the way later humans would read books. Every broken twig, every disturbed pebble, every scratch on a rock face tells part of the story, where the animals went, how fast they were moving, how long ago they passed, whether they were calm or frightened. The group follows the trail for hours. No rushing, just steady walking, stopping periodically to check signs and adjust their strategy. This long, patient stalking is the part that never makes it into the dramatic retellings. It requires more mental endurance than physical strength. Around midday, they finally spot the herd. 8 antelope grazing peacefully in a shallow valley near a waterhole. Now comes the critical decision point. Do they attempt a close ambush, trying to get within spear range without being noticed? Or do they use the technique that humans, uniquely among all predators, have perfected? They choose persistence. Hunting. Here is what makes humans such terrifyingly effective predators. We cannot outrun almost any animal in a short sprint. A healthy antelope can reach 50 miles per hour. A human tops out around 15. But we have something no other animal possesses. We can run for hours in the heat of the day without overheating. Our nearly hairless bodies and extraordinary capacity for sweating give us an endurance advantage that is almost unmatched. Most animals, covered in fur and lacking efficient cooling systems, have to stop and rest after intense exertion, or they will literally overheat from the inside. Which is, when you think about it, a rather undignified way to lose a race. The hunters spread out and begin to jog toward the herd at a steady, sustainable trot. Not a sprint, just a pace they can maintain. The antelope spot them immediately and bolt, disappearing over a ridge in seconds. But the humans do not stop. They follow the tracks at that same steady pace, reading the signs, keeping up the pressure. An hour passes. 2 hours. The sun is brutal now, the kind of heat that would drop most predators in their tracks. But the humans keep moving. Their bodies are designed for exactly this kind of endurance. They are sweating profusely. But that is the point. Each drop of moisture evaporating from their skin is carrying away heat that would otherwise build up and shut down their muscles. They find the herd again. The antelope run, but they are already showing signs of stress. Their tongues are hanging out. They are panting heavily. They cannot cool down fast enough. The chase continues. 3 hours. 4. The trackers rotate the lead position, allowing individuals to drop back and recover slightly while others maintain the pressure. This is cooperative hunting at its finest. No single human could do this alone. But a coordinated group communicating constantly and sharing the effort can accomplish what seems impossible. Finally, after nearly 5 hours, they close in on a single antelope that has become separated from the herd. The animal is stumbling now, its cooling system overwhelmed, its muscles beginning to fail from the combination of heat and exhaustion. One hunter moves in close enough for a spear throw. The weapon flies true, striking behind the shoulder, and moments later, it is over. The hunters stand around the fallen animal, not cheering or celebrating yet. First comes the practical work. One of them makes a quick, precise cut and offers a prayer or acknowledgement. We cannot know the exact words or gestures, but evidence from many prehistoric sites suggests early humans performed some kind of ritual around successful kills. A moment of respect for the animal that gave its life. Gratitude to whatever spirits or forces they believed governed the hunt, which was, one might argue, a rather more civilized approach than simply high-fiving and taking selfies. Then comes the butchering, which is itself a sophisticated technical operation. These hunters know animal anatomy better than most modern surgeons know human anatomy. Every muscle group, every organ, every useful piece is understood. They work quickly and efficiently. The hide comes off in one clean piece, valuable for clothing and shelter. The choicest cuts of meat are separated for immediate eating and for carrying back to camp. Organs that spoil quickly are prepared for eating on the spot. Nothing is wasted. Even the bones will eventually be cracked open for their rich marrow, one of the most nutrient-dense foods available. Waste not, want not, a principle that modern civilization has largely forgotten in favor of plastic packaging. But here is the practical problem. They are 5 miles from camp and they have just produced several hundred pounds of meat and useful materials. They cannot carry it all in one trip. And leaving meat unattended means lions, hyenas, and vultures will claim it within hours. This is where the social dimension of hunting becomes crucial. 2 runners head back to camp at speed to bring reinforcements. The rest stay with the kill, building a fire to keep scavengers away, and beginning the process of smoking some of the meat for preservation. Within a few hours, more people arrive from camp. Elders, children, old enough to help carry, nursing mothers who left their infants with relatives. Everyone participates in the harvest. The trip back to camp becomes a celebration. Successful hunts are rare enough that they turn into social events. There will be feasting tonight, stories told around the fire, probably dancing and music. The hunters will recount the long chase in vivid detail. And in the telling, it will become part of the community's collective memory. Another story to teach young people about strategy, persistence, and the power of cooperation. But let us be very clear about something. This does not happen every day or even every week. Between successful hunts, there are dozens of failed attempts, tracks that lead nowhere, animals that prove too fast or too alert, injuries that force the hunters to turn back. Hunts that simply do not work out despite everyone doing everything right. And this is crucial to understanding prehistoric life. Hunting was important, absolutely. It provided concentrated protein and fat that gathering alone could not match. The social bonds formed during cooperative hunts helped cement group cohesion. The skills required, tracking, weapon crafting, strategic planning, pushed the development of human intelligence and communication. But hunting was never the main source of calories for most prehistoric groups. That honor belonged to gathering, which happened every day, provided the majority of nutrition, and did not require risking life and limb. Hunting was the occasional glory, the high-stakes gamble that sometimes paid off spectacularly. What made early humans successful was not that they were the best hunters on Earth. It was that they were good enough at hunting while also being excellent at everything else: gathering, tool-making, social cooperation, adapting to new environments. They were generalists who could call on specialist skills when needed. And the hunt, when it succeeded, was just one bright thread in the complex, beautiful tapestry of prehistoric survival. Tomorrow, whether today's hunt succeeded or failed, there would still be roots to dig nuts, to gather tools to repair, children to teach, and the endless patient work of staying alive in a world that was beautiful, abundant, and occasionally willing to reward the clever, the persistent, and the deeply cooperative. Chapter 6. The fine and ancient tradition of hitting rocks together until they become something useful. By midday, the camp was alive with a sound that would have been instantly recognizable to any craftsperson throughout all of human history, had any of them been around to hear it. It was the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of stone on stone, not loud, not violent, just steady, purposeful, and precise. The sound of someone making something that had not existed before, which, when you think about it, is one of the more optimistic noises the universe has ever produced. Your aunt was sitting on a flat rock near the central fire, a hammerstone in one hand and a piece of flint in the other. Every few seconds she struck the flint at exactly the right angle, sending a small, thin flake spinning off into the dust. Around her lay a scatter of rejected pieces and failed attempts. The kind of archaeological debris that would still be visible 40,000 years later, quietly telling its story to anyone who had learned to read stone. And people would learn to read stone, which says something rather touching about humanity's stubborn refusal to leave well enough alone. This was not occasional work. This was daily maintenance, as essential as eating or sleeping, because in a world without metal, without factories, without the ability to simply walk to a store and buy replacements, tools did not last forever. That spear point you used yesterday might have chipped when it struck bone. The scraper someone used last week to process a hide now had a dull edge that was almost useless. You made your tools, or you did not survive. It was a refreshingly straightforward arrangement, but here is what is truly remarkable. Stone tool making. What archaeologists would one day call napping was never something you simply figured out in an afternoon. It was a high skill that took years to master, requiring an intimate understanding of stone properties that bordered on reverence. Different rocks behaved in different ways. Flint was predictable and forgiving. Obsidian was razor-sharp but brittle. Chert was reliable but harder to work. You had to know where to find good stone, how to test it by eye and by touch, how to recognize quality before you invested hours of labor. It was, in its own quiet way, the world's first material science degree, and it came with no student loans. If you watched your aunt working, you would see expertise that had taken a lifetime to acquire. She was not hitting rocks together randomly. She was reading the stone, seeing lines of potential fracture that were invisible to untrained eyes. Each strike was calculated with care. Too hard, and the piece would shatter uselessly. Too soft, and nothing would happen. The angle had to be exact. The point of impact had to be chosen with precision. It was geometry and physics, executed entirely through intuition and muscle memory, which is considerably more elegant than most modern engineering meetings. The technique she was using was called the prepared core method, and it represented centuries of accumulated knowledge. She had spent the past hour carefully shaping this piece of flint, removing flakes in a deliberate sequence to create a core with exactly the right shape and angle. Now she was ready for the payoff. One perfect, controlled strike, and a long, thin blade detached cleanly from the core, sharp enough to slice through hide or meat with almost no pressure. She examined it critically, running her thumb lightly along the edge, then nodded with quiet satisfaction. Good enough. But she was not finished. The blade still needed to be hafted, attached to a handle that would make it truly useful. This was where craft became art. She had already prepared a wooden handle earlier, a piece of hardwood with a slot carefully carved into one end. Now she pulled out a small leather pouch containing pine resin she had collected and heated until it became sticky. She mixed it with a bit of charcoal and crushed bone for extra strength. This would become the prehistoric equivalent of super glue. Watching her work, you would notice something fascinating. She did not need to think about most of the steps anymore. Her hands moved automatically through processes she had performed thousands of times. Heat the resin over the fire just long enough. Apply it carefully to the slot in the handle. Position the blade with perfect alignment. Wrap the joint with thin strips of sinew that would shrink and tighten as they dried, creating a bond that could withstand heavy use. The entire process took maybe 10 minutes, but it drew on decades of experience and generations of accumulated knowledge. Quite possibly the most reliable adhesive technology the world would see until someone invented duct tape. Near her, your brother was working on a completely different problem. He had a piece of antler from the deer killed 3 days earlier, and he was slowly, patiently carving it into a spear point. This was different from stonework. Antler was organic, flexible, able to absorb impacts that would shatter stone. But it was also harder to shape and required different tools and different techniques. He was using a stone burin, a chisel-like tool, to scrape and carve the antler with steady, deliberate strokes. The work was tedious, producing a constant, soft scraping sound that formed a gentle counterpoint to your aunt's rhythmic napping. Thin curls of antler fell away with each pass, accumulating in a small pile at his feet. Every so often he would stop, test the point against his thumb, checking for sharpness and balance. This point would be lighter and more flexible than the stone-tipped spears most hunters used. It could be thrown farther and was less likely to break on impact. But it took hours to make. Antler was only available when someone successfully hunted a deer or similar animal. Stone was everywhere. Antler was precious, so you used it carefully for special purposes, and you made sure everyone in the group knew exactly who had made what. Because here is something the archaeological record has only recently begun to reveal: prehistoric craftspeople took real pride in their work. We know this because we find tools that are more beautiful than they strictly needed to be. Stone points shaped with perfect symmetry, even though asymmetrical ones would have worked just as well. Bone needles decorated with tiny carved patterns. Antler spear throwers shaped into the forms of animals. Nobody bothers to decorate something that is purely functional unless they care about aesthetics, unless they want their work to be recognizable, admired, remembered. Your brother's spear point would be efficient, yes, but it would also be beautiful. Because when you carried it, when you used it to feed your family, you wanted everyone to know who had made it. Status, reputation, and personal identity were all conveyed through craftsmanship, which was, one must admit, a rather more elegant system than modern business cards. Across the camp, 3 women were working on an equally essential task: clothing production. One was scraping a deer hide that had been stretched tight across a wooden frame, using a stone scraper to remove every last trace of fat and membrane from the inner surface. The sound was distinctive, a rhythmic scraping that carried clearly across the camp. Her hands moved in steady, overlapping strokes, making sure no spot was missed. This was not quick work. A single hide could require hours of patient scraping, and even then you were not finished. The hide still had to be treated, either smoked carefully over a low fire or rubbed thoroughly with a mixture of brain tissue and fat that prevented it from becoming stiff and brittle when it dried. The brain tanning process was chemistry without laboratories, developed through centuries of trial and error. Somehow, someone had discovered that brains contained exactly the right compounds to preserve leather. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe it was systematic experimentation. Either way, the knowledge had been passed from parent to child for generations. Quite possibly the world's first example of waste not, want not applied to neurology. Nearby, her sister was working on a hide that had already been tanned. She held a bone awl, a pointed tool for punching holes, and she was slowly, methodically creating a garment. Punch a hole, thread sinew through it, punch another hole. The stitching was simple by modern standards, but remarkably strong and effective. These clothes would be warm, durable, and flexible. They would last for seasons, perhaps even years, protecting their wearers from cold that could kill in a matter of hours. The third woman was doing something that would have seemed almost impossible to earlier generations. She was sewing with an actual needle. A tiny piece of bone drilled with a hole at one end and threaded with sinew. This technology was less than 20,000 years old in your time, a relatively recent innovation that had completely changed clothing production. With needles, you could make garments that actually fit the body, that could be tailored to individuals, that could be decorated with sewn-on beads or strips of dyed leather. She was making winter clothing for her daughter, fur-lined, layered, warm enough for the brutal cold that would arrive in a few months. The little girl sat nearby, watching intently, occasionally reaching out to try to help. This was how knowledge was transferred, not through formal instruction, but through constant patient observation and imitation. By the time the girl was 10, she would be competent at basic hide work. By 20, she might be one of the most skilled leather workers in the entire band. But clothing and tools were not the only things being made. An older man sat a little apart, working on something smaller and more delicate. He had a collection of shells he had traded for last summer when a neighboring band visited from the coast, a journey of 3 weeks on foot. Now he was drilling tiny holes in them with a stone drill, a painstaking process that required steady hands and seemingly infinite patience. These would become beads strung on plant fiber cord to make necklaces or bracelets. They were purely decorative, purely social. No one needed jewelry to survive. Yet humans had been making it for at least 100,000 years, probably longer. Because survival alone was never enough. People needed beauty. They needed status markers. They needed ways to express identity and affiliation. Those beads said many things at once. I have connections to the coast. I have time to make beautiful things. I value aesthetics. All of that meaning carried in a few pierced shells on a simple string, which was, one might argue, a rather more poetic form of communication than most modern social media. What is striking about all this activity is the growing specialization. Not everyone was equally good at everything. Your aunt had spent decades mastering stonework and was genuinely expert at it. Your brother excelled at antler and bone carving, but was only adequate at knapping flint. The woman making the winter clothing was the best leather worker in the band, and when her skills were needed, others gladly contributed extra food or help with other tasks in exchange. This was not yet a market economy, but it was close. A recognition that different people had different talents and that the whole group benefited when those talents were allowed to flourish. It was also the quiet foundation for something that would become increasingly important in later human societies: social complexity. In groups where everyone could do everything equally well, there was little basis for hierarchy or status differences. But when individuals developed specialized skills that others needed, power and influence began to shift in subtle ways. The best toolmaker, the best leather worker, the best artist. Each gained a kind of respect that went beyond simple physical strength or hunting success. And everywhere, children watched. A boy of maybe 8 sat near your aunt, trying to copy her movements with his own small stones. Most of his attempts failed, producing nothing useful, but she encouraged him anyway. Occasionally she would reach over, take his hand in hers, and guide the strike, showing him the right angle. This was education, Paleolithic style. No schools, no formal curriculum, no tests. Just constant observation and patient practice under the gentle guidance of experts. By the time the boy was 15, he might be competent at basic toolmaking. By 25, if he had talent and dedication, he might be expert enough to teach others, and the knowledge would flow forward to another generation, each one adding small refinements, tiny improvements that would accumulate over centuries into genuine technological revolutions. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky, and the sounds of craft continued. Tapping, scraping the soft crackle of the fire, occasional quiet conversation, creating the material culture that made human life possible. Building it one patient stroke at a time, laying the foundation for everything that would come after. Which was, when you think about it, a rather more satisfying way to spend an afternoon than doom scrolling. Chapter 7. The Astonishing Discovery. That early humans had more free time than most modern office workers. If you imagine early humans as exhausted, half-starved figures trudging endlessly across the landscape, constantly hunting, constantly gathering, forever on the brink of collapse, you are not alone. That image has been drilled into us for decades by various well-meaning but slightly dramatic documentaries. Life before civilization, we have been solemnly informed, was nasty, brutish, and short. A constant, desperate struggle for survival with no time for anything except raw, grinding work. This, as the guide would put it, is complete and utter tosh. When anthropologists began living with modern hunter-gatherer societies and actually counted how people spent their hours, a process that involved a lot of polite note-taking and trying not to look too surprised, a very different and far more generous picture emerged. On average, adults in many foraging societies devoted only about 4 to 6 hours a day to what we would call work, finding food, preparing it, maintaining tools, and basic camp upkeep. The rest of the day was not filled with frantic scrambling or anxious searching. It was filled with nothing in particular. Resting, talking, playing, making music, grooming one another, staring into the distance, simply existing in the company of others. Which, when you think about it, sounds suspiciously like the sort of lifestyle that modern wellness gurus charge thousands of pounds to teach you how to achieve. If you took a day 40,000 years ago and plotted it on a modern timesheet, it would probably confuse any corporate manager completely. Yes, there were bursts of intense effort, tracking animals for hours, carrying heavy loads of gathered food back to camp, shaping stone tools with careful precision. But those bursts were surrounded by long stretches of low-intensity, flexible time. Time. You could bend around your body's energy, the weather, the mood of the group, the needs of the moment. Time that had not yet been sliced into neat little rectangles labelled meeting, email, and pretending to look busy while actually thinking about lunch. So what did people actually do with all those spacious hours? A great deal of it would look surprisingly familiar and strangely slow to us. You rested. That might mean lying on your side in a patch of shade, half listening to the easy chatter of your relatives. It might mean sitting near the fire, absently turning a smooth pebble in your fingers while watching the smoke drift upward in lazy, twisting ribbons. When your body was your only real tool, preserving its strength and health was part of wisdom, not laziness. Modern humans call this self-care, and then feel guilty about it. Your ancestors simply did it. You socialized. Conversation in a small band of 20 or 30 people was never optional background noise. It was the living web that held the entire group together. Every casual mention of who saw which herd of animals yesterday, who found a new stand of tubers, who argued with whom last night. These were not idle gossip. They were sophisticated information sharing systems, quiet conflict management strategies, and emotional first aid, all rolled into one. Far more efficient than most modern HR departments. You played with children. You let them climb all over you like a living jungle gym. You showed them how to throw little sticks at a target, or how to handle a piece of sharp stone without cutting themselves. Their games might look like pure chaos, but through them they were quietly rehearsing adulthood, practicing coordination, testing social boundaries, experimenting with risk and trust in the safest possible way. No one had yet invented the concept of structured playtime or educational toys. They just played, and somehow everyone learned anyway. For long stretches of the day, there was no urgent agenda, no tight schedule, no alarm clock dragging you from one task to the next. The pace of life was dictated by the slow cycles of the sun, the seasons, and the movements of animals, not by the minute hand on a dial. This was, one might argue, a rather more civilized arrangement. And then, somewhere inside all that unscheduled time, something beautiful began to happen. Humans started to invent fun. Archaeologists have found small objects at prehistoric sites that do not fit neatly into any category of tool or weapon. Tiny carved animals made of bone or antler. Smooth, shaped pieces of stone drilled through the center like early spinning tops. Little figurines of people, sometimes exaggerated in strange and playful ways. To a hungry adult crouched over a fire, these might not seem important, but to a child, they were pure magic. You can picture it clearly. A small hand trying to spin a stone disc on the packed earth. Two children pretending to hunt with miniature spears made from twigs, a parent half amused and half attentive. Letting them help with a task that did not really need helping. Play was never a distraction from real life. It was real life. Through play, children learn to aim, to negotiate, to share, to lead, and to follow. There are even hints of games for adults, certain small stones and bones found together in patterns that suggest early dice or counters, etched lines on flat rock surfaces that may have been simple game boards. Places where pieces were moved back and forth in quiet competitions that passed the time and strengthened social bonds. We do not know the exact rules they used or what they played for, but the impulse is unmistakable. When immediate needs were met, human minds naturally looked for patterns, for gentle challenges, for little puzzles to solve. Games were structured daydreams, and early humans seem to have had plenty of time for them. And then there was music. In caves across Europe, archaeologists have discovered delicate flutes carved from bird bones and mammoth ivory, some of them more than 40,000 years old. They are not crude noisemakers. Some have carefully spaced holes that produce recognizable musical scales. Someone sat down and experimented, adjusting each hole by tiny amounts, learning by ear how to turn raw bone into a working instrument. Imagine the first time someone in your band brought one of those flutes out beside the fire. The sky is dark. The stars are beginning to appear. Embers are glowing softly. They lift the flute to their lips, take a breath, and a strange, clear sound rises above the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of voices. For a moment, everyone freezes. Then the notes repeat, hesitant at first, then growing more confident. Someone starts to clap a rhythm. Another person taps a stick against a log. Feet begin to move. Bodies sway. The camp, which only minutes earlier was quietly settling in for the night, suddenly comes alive with dance. Music and dance were more than entertainment. They synchronized bodies and minds. When everyone moved together, breathed together, and let their voices rise and fall together, something powerful happened in the brain. Group identity grew stronger. Anxiety faded. For a little while the world felt coherent and safe. In small, vulnerable bands of early humans, those shared moments of rhythm may have been as important for survival as any spear or any shelter. After the dancing came the other great technology of leisure, stories. You are back at the fire. The night is quiet now. A few last sparks drift upward like tiny glowing insects. The older members of the group edge closer to the flames. Children lean against their parents. Someone, perhaps the best storyteller in the band, begins a tale. It might be about the last great hunt when the wind changed suddenly and nearly ruined everything. It might be about the time the river flooded and the group had to move camp in the middle of the night. It might be about a trickster animal who stole fire, or a spirit who lived in the thunderclouds and punished the greedy. Some of these stories were clearly about real events. Others reached deep into the world of myth and imagination. But all of them carried something important. A warning, a clever strategy, a memory of who did what and why it mattered. Without writing, without records, stories were the memory of the group. They carried vital information across years and generations, where the good water could be found in a dry season, which plants could cure a fever and which could kill you. What happened the last time someone broke a particular social rule? Listening to these tales by firelight, half awake and half drifting, you were not just being entertained. You were being trained quietly and gently for the rest of your life. But not all of this spacious time was spent in conversation, music, or play. Some of it was given to the slow, meticulous work of grooming. If you have ever watched primates in a documentary, you have seen it. Monkeys and apes carefully parting each other's fur, picking out dirt and parasites, inspecting skin with total concentration. It looks fussy, but it serves two deep purposes: hygiene and bonding. Early humans did the same, though with a slightly different twist. No thick fur, but plenty of hair. You would sit with your back to a friend or sibling or partner while they gently combed through your scalp with their fingers or with a simple comb made from bone or wood. They would pick at little bumps, remove bits of debris, crush an unlucky louse between their nails. It was both practical and deeply soothing, the kind of intimate contact that says without words, you matter. I am paying attention to you. Then came decoration. Red ochre, a naturally occurring iron-rich pigment, shows up at human sites going back hundreds of thousands of years. It was often ground into powder mixed with fat or water and applied to skin or hair. Was it sunscreen? Insect repellent? Symbolic body paint? It may have been all three at once. You would sit while someone traced lines on your face, your chest, your arms. Maybe they marked you as a member of a particular band. Maybe they signaled your role in a coming ritual or your status as someone who had completed a dangerous hunt. Hair was braided, beards were trimmed or decorated. Simple jewelry made from shells, teeth, or carved bone was threaded through hair or hung from cords around wrists and necks. These acts took time. They were not required to eat, drink, or stay alive, but they were part of how early humans turned bare survival into a life filled with identity, beauty, and meaning. And in between all the talking and playing and decorating and music making, there were long stretches of something that in the modern world we have almost forgotten how to do, simply watching. You might lie on your back and look at the clouds drifting across the sky. You might sit quietly and follow the path of a line of ants carrying food back to their nest. You might stand at the edge of camp and watch a herd of animals grazing in the distance, the way they clustered and scattered, how the wind shifted their scent. You might trace the patterns of stars, noticing how certain constellations rose at particular times of year, how the moon waxed and waned. To a modern observer, this might look like boredom. But for early humans, this constant, gentle observing was part of how they built an intimate mental map of their world. It trained attention, it sharpened intuition. The person who had spent hundreds of evenings quietly watching the sky might be the first to notice an unusual pattern of clouds that hinted at an approaching storm. The child who had spent endless hours following animal tracks just for fun might become the best tracker in the band without ever being formally taught. And there was something else here, something less practical and more mysterious. When you had no glowing screens, no written words, no background music piped in from distant speakers, silence and stillness did not feel empty. They felt full of insect hum and bird calls, the sigh of wind through grass, the distant rush of water, the soft breathing of people you loved nearby. In that stillness, the boundary between you and the world could feel thinner. You were not a separate mind trapped in a frantic schedule, glancing at nature through a window on your day off. You were an animal in an environment, embedded in it, attentive to it, shaped by it. So the day of an early human 40,000 years ago was not a blur of endless toil. It was a balanced pattern of effort and ease, of focused work and rambling leisure, hunting and gathering and crafting, yes, but also joking, singing, dancing, grooming, decorating, storytelling, cloud-watching, stargazing. Their lives were dangerous in ways ours usually are not. Illness, injury, and hunger were always nearby. But they also had something that has become rare in many modern lives, long, unbroken stretches of time in which nothing urgent had to be done. Time to let the mind wander. Time to be with others without an agenda. Time to simply be awake and present in a living world. And as the fire died down and the last story faded into the warmth of the night, that spacious feeling followed you gently into sleep. Tomorrow there would be work again. But there would also be music and laughter and the slow, quiet business of being human. Chapter 8. The complex social dynamics of a group of 30 people who couldn't simply unfriend each other. You were never alone out there on the savannah, or in the forest, or along the icy riverbank. You lived inside a band, not a village, not a town, not anything we would call a city. Just a small, intimate human world of maybe 20, 30, or 40 people, rarely more than 50. It was small enough that you knew every voice, every laugh, every footstep in the dark. You could tell who was walking behind you simply by the way their foot scraped the ground. You could recognize a cough in the middle of the night. This size was not an accident. It was how your species worked best. Bands that were too small could not defend themselves, could not share enough skills, could not find enough marriage partners. Bands that grew too large became unstable. Too many conflicts, too many mouths to feed, too difficult to move together when the herds left or the seasons changed. So, natural selection, culture, and simple everyday practicality had all pushed your ancestors into that perfect sweet spot, a living room-sized society that was intimate, flexible, and deeply personal. Everyone in that little group lived inside your mental map. Who was generous? Who tended to be lazy? Who could be trusted to keep a secret? Who would quietly share food when the hunt went badly? Who would slip your child an extra piece of dried meat when you were not looking? These invisible maps of relationships were every bit as important as stone tools or fire. They were how your people survived. And where there are close relationships, there is also conflict. Not courtroom drama or kings and judges, but everyday human frictions. Someone took more meat than they had earned. Someone flirted with another person's partner. Someone skipped their turn watching the fire. In a band this small, you could not simply walk away and never see them again. You would be sleeping 10 feet from them tonight. So peace was kept with the oldest tools human beings ever invented: gossip, teasing, reputation, and the quiet wisdom of elders. Gossip in your world was never idle chatter. It was law enforcement, news, and social media all rolled into one. When two hunters argued over who had wounded the antelope first, people noticed. The story travelled around the fire that night, retold and gently reshaped. By the time it had made the rounds, everyone knew who had been selfish, who had been generous, who had apologized, and who was holding a grudge. No one wrote anything down, yet nothing was ever forgotten. If someone hoarded food, that became a story. Remember when he hid that marrow bone? The next time resources were tight, people might be slower to share with him. If someone was brave during a dangerous hunt or kind to a sick elder, that became a story too. These stories were your social credit score. They decided who received help when they were in trouble, who was trusted with important tasks, who was invited into serious conversations. For bigger conflicts, you did not have a courthouse. You had elders. The older woman who had seen 100 arguments about meat and marriage, the man who remembered the last time two brothers almost came to blows, and how it was settled. They were not judges in the modern sense. People simply turned to them when tempers flared. They sat between the angry parties, spoke slowly, brought up past events, added context, reminded everyone of shared hardships and past kindnesses. Mediation was a survival strategy. A feud in a band of 30 could be a death sentence for everyone. Split the group in half, and suddenly each side was too small to defend itself, too weak to move far, too vulnerable to the next bad winter. So the whole social system was quietly biased toward reconciliation. People teased instead of accusing directly. They complained in roundabout ways. They sang songs that hinted at bad behavior without naming names. It might sound indirect, but that gentle pressure was powerful. It let people change without losing face. It let them step back from the edge before anyone got hurt. Underneath all of this ran a simple, unbreakable truth. Your survival depended on other people. That truth began the moment you were born. In your band, children did not belong to just one nuclear family in the modern sense. They belonged to the entire camp, to the whole network. Your mother mattered, your father mattered, but so did your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, your older siblings, and even unrelated adults who had quietly been adopted into the family circle. In the language of modern anthropology, this is called cooperative breeding. In the language of your ancestors, it was simply life. Your mother might be off gathering roots, carrying your younger sibling, or helping process meat. Someone else would keep you entertained. An aunt letting you gnaw on a bit of hide, an older cousin showing you how to stack little stones, a grandmother humming a rhythmic pattern while she braided cord. Your brain quietly absorbed the sounds of your language. It truly took a village. It was not a metaphor, it was a job description. If your mother died or was injured or simply had to walk all day to track a migrating herd, you did not automatically die with her. There were other breasts to nurse from, other arms to carry you, other minds deeply invested in your survival. That redundancy, many adults caring for the same children, was an invisible safety net woven through every early human life. It also freed people to specialize. Some adults were naturally patient teachers. Some excelled at rough play that taught balance and strength. Some were gifted at comforting a child who woke from a nightmare. The result was that by the time you were 10 or 12, you had learned from an entire village worth of teachers, each one passing on tiny fragments of knowledge they themselves had received from their parents and grandparents. Relationships and partnerships inside this world were more varied than any single model. Different environments, different cultures, and different times probably saw different patterns. In some bands, long-term pair bonds were common, partners raising children together across many seasons. In others, partnerships were more fluid, forming and dissolving as circumstances changed. There could be arrangements we would today call polygynous or polyandrous, especially in tough environments where sharing resources was critical. The key point is that there was no single, natural, prehistoric marriage model. What remained constant was the need to manage jealousy, share food and care, and protect the children. Formal taboos, joking relationships, and unspoken rules all evolved to make this possible. Who could approach whom? Who owed whom? Meat or favors? Who could joke about what in public? These patterns acted like quiet traffic lights, guiding everyone safely through the emotional maze of desire, loyalty, and responsibility. And a band of 30 was never the whole world. Beyond the circle of familiar faces around your fire lived other bands, other groups speaking similar languages or dialects, tied to you by distant cousinship, old alliances, or simple habit. You might see them only a few times a year, but those visits were some of the most important events in your life. Imagine late summer or the end of the dry season when resources were temporarily abundant in one particular valley. Herds gathered, fish were running, fruit trees hung heavy. Word spread not through phones or maps, but through chains of chance meetings. A lone hunter passing another band and mentioning where the game was thick, a visiting cousin talking about a riverbend full of fish. Slowly, the bands converged. This was your version of a festival. At these seasonal gatherings, trade blossomed. A man from a coastal group brought shells and dried fish. Someone from the mountains brought obsidian for blades. Others offered ochre for paint, fine skins, carved bone tools. Objects travelled hundreds of miles in small jumps, changing hands again and again, each exchange sealed with conversation, stories, and maybe a shared meal. Mating happened here too. If your band only had 30 people, you did not want everyone pairing up inside that tiny circle, generation after generation. Inbreeding was a silent killer. So, alliances with other bands mattered. Young people met potential partners from outside. Some returned to your band with a new mate. Some left to join another group permanently. In modern terms, this was population genetics. For your ancestors, it was simply life moving forward. These gatherings were also where information spread. Someone had discovered a better way to attach stone points to spears using plant resin. Someone had found a valley where winter was a little less harsh. Someone had noticed a new predator in the area. Stories, warnings, and techniques rippled outward through these networks like radio transmissions traveling across the continent, except they were carried in memories and spoken words instead of wires. All of this rested on one extraordinary human adaptation: language. Not just grunts and gestures, but rich, layered, flexible speech. The ability to say not merely "lion there," but "3 lions came from that ravine last dry season when the river was low, so do not camp there with small children." The ability to explain a hunting strategy, share a dream, tell a joke, sing a lullaby. By 40,000 years ago, your ancestors almost certainly had languages as capable as any spoken today. Different vocabularies, different rhythms, but the same basic machinery of syntax, tense, metaphor, humor, and love. Language let your band coordinate complex hunts. It let elders warn children about dangers they had never personally seen. It let news of a drought in the next valley reach you before you ran out of food. And at night, lying half asleep near the fire, language let you drift on waves of quiet storytelling. Tales of heroic animals, clever ancestors, dangerous spirits, lost lovers. In this world, the elderly were never pushed aside. They were living libraries. In a physically demanding life, an old body could not do everything it once could. Knees ached, eyes blurred, hands shook a little when napping stone. But the mind, honed by decades of experience, became more valuable with every passing year. The old man, who could no longer chase a deer, still remembered which stars marked the change of season. The grandmother, who could no longer gather far from camp, still knew which plants cured stomach pain and which were deadly. The elder, who had lived through a brutal winter, could advise when it was time to move, even if the sky and ground looked deceptively calm. When a child's fever spiked, the elders recalled past fevers and what had helped. When smoke on the horizon hinted at a distant fire, they remembered the last time the forest burned, which animals fled, which way, which valley stayed safe. They were walking libraries of famine and abundance, of floods and dry years, of conflicts and reconciliations. In a world without books, losing an elder suddenly was like a modern library catching fire overnight. Which brings us gently to death. People died young, from infection, injury, childbirth, hunting accidents, or simply falling from a tree. But what stands out in the archaeological record is not only the fact of death, it is how people responded to it. We find graves that were prepared with care, skeletons curled in fetal positions, sometimes dusted with red ochre as if painted for a final journey, individuals buried with tools, beads, pieces of meat, animal teeth or ornaments. In some Neanderthal sites, bodies appear to have been laid to rest in pits that were then deliberately filled, perhaps even with flowers. This suggests something more than simple disposal. It hints at ritual. Maybe your band believed the dead continued in another place. Maybe they became animals. Maybe they watched over the living. Maybe there were stories about a shadow world under the ground or above the clouds. Whatever the specific belief, one thing seems clear: death was not treated as nothing. When someone died in your camp, the ordinary rhythm broke. Gathering trips were postponed. Hunts were quieter. People sat closer together at night. Words were spoken more softly. Children asked questions. Adults told stories about the dead person's bravery, generosity, or even their foolish mistakes. Death, too, became part of the gossip of the group, but in a different register. Not about behavior to be judged, but about meaning to be found. The act of burying the dead with care did something powerful for the living. It knitted them together in shared grief, shared memory, shared fear, and shared hope. In that sense, social life and community were never pleasant. Add-ons to early human existence. They were the core technology that made everything else possible. Your ancestors did not survive because they were the strongest individuals. They survived because they were embedded in networks of care, obligation, communication, and memory. Around that small circle of 20 to 50 familiar faces. Faces you knew better than your own reflection. The entire human story was already unfolding. Cooperation and conflict, love and jealousy, wisdom and foolishness, birth and loss. A tiny moving tribe carrying fire, tools, stories, and genes across the landscape. As the sun drifts lower and the day begins to cool, those bonds of community will shape the last hours of your prehistoric day. How you gather around the fire, what you sing, what you remember, and what you dare to dream about for tomorrow. Chapter 9. Cave paintings, Venus figurines, and the general existential business of trying to make sense of it all. By the time the hunting and gathering of the day were done, when bellies were mostly full and the fire had burned down to a steady orange glow, something else usually began. Something that did not fill the stomach or sharpen a spear, but still felt deeply necessary. Your ancestors had another job besides staying alive. They had to make sense of being alive, which is, when you think about it, a rather ambitious project for a species that had only recently worked out how to keep fire from going out. Picture the entrance of a cave as night falls. The last light is fading outside, the air grows cooler, and the sounds of insects and distant animal calls begin to rise. Inside, the fire paints the walls with moving shadows. Someone picks up a piece of red ochre. Someone else unrolls a length of sinew with shell beads threaded onto it. In the half-darkness, people start to transform themselves and the world around them. To us, it looks like art and religion. To them, it was probably just life. The same way breathing is just life, only with more dramatic lighting. Let us start with the most famous evidence of that inner world. Deep in the dark, far from the cave mouth, far beyond where anyone needed to go to sleep or store food, there are paintings, not casual doodles near the entrance. Not quick sketches you might make while waiting out the rain. Some of the most spectacular images from Ice Age Europe appear hundreds of meters underground, in places you cannot even reach without crawling or climbing. Places where no sunlight has ever reached. Horses, bison, lions, woolly rhinoceroses, mammoths, herds flowing across the stone as if the rock itself was alive. Carefully chosen curves in the cave wall become the bulging shoulder of a bison, the arch of an animal's ribs, the swell of a horse's chest. Some images are shaded and layered so they seem to move in the flickering torchlight. This was not interior decoration. Nobody lived down there. To create these paintings, people had to gather torches, fuel, pigments, and tools. They had to organize expeditions into absolute darkness. They had to know the cave well enough not to get lost. They chose these places deliberately, then filled them with images that, as far as we know, only they would ever see. Why go to such effort and risk? We do not know for certain, but there are clues. One possibility is teaching. Imagine the hunters of your group bringing adolescents into the cave, torches in hand, pointing at the painted herds while they tell stories, where to aim your spear, how a wounded animal behaves. Which season the bison pass through which valley. The cave walls become a kind of three-dimensional blackboard, a school hidden under the earth. Another possibility is ritual. In many traditional societies, images of animals are not just pictures, they are tools to influence reality, to draw a successful hunt into being before it happens, to honor the spirit of the animals you depend on, to apologize even for taking their lives. Those painted bison may have been more like prayers than paintings. Or maybe it was both. Teaching wrapped inside myth, practical knowledge encoded in sacred stories, a ritual hunt painted in the dark that prepared you for a real hunt at dawn. And still the question lingers, why so deep? Why risk the dangers of underground tunnels when a rock face outside would work just as well? Some archaeologists believe those deep chambers were chosen exactly because they cut you off from ordinary life. Once you were down there, there was no day or night, no horizon, no weather, just stone, darkness, fire, voices, and whatever moved inside your own mind. That is the perfect setting for altered states of consciousness, which is a fancy way of saying it was an excellent place to have a really good think about the universe. Which brings us to something we cannot fossilize, but can clearly infer. Early spirituality. Across many hunter-gatherer cultures today, there are figures we would call shamans, people who dance, chant, fast, or sometimes use psychoactive plants to enter trance states. They travel to other realms, speak with ancestors, negotiate with animal spirits, heal the sick. If something like that existed tens of thousands of years ago, and the evidence strongly suggests it might have, it would make perfect sense to bring those ceremonies deep underground into the very belly of the earth itself. In the dark caves of Europe, archaeologists have found strange clusters of dots, lines, and geometric signs around the animals. Not just realistic pictures, but abstract marks, ladders, zigzags, hand stencils, series of dots that may line up with lunar cycles. Some researchers think these marks formed an early notational system, a way of counting days, tracking seasons, maybe even predicting migrations. Others believe those shapes resemble the geometric patterns people see in visions during trance. If that is true, then the walls of these caves are not only records of animals, but records of experiences inside the human mind, which is rather impressive when you consider that the human mind had only recently worked out how to keep itself from being eaten. While all this was happening underground, something else was happening on the surface. People were decorating themselves. Long before the famous cave paintings of Europe, tens of thousands of years earlier, humans in Africa were already grinding ochre, iron-rich minerals, into powder. They mixed it with fat or water, they rubbed it on their skin, they smeared it on tools. They used it to stain hides. At sites more than 100,000 years old, archaeologists have found pieces of ochre deliberately shaped and engraved, as well as shells pierced for threading. Little beads worn smooth where they rubbed against skin or clothing. Stained with pigment, necklaces, bracelets, maybe anklets that jingled when you walked or danced. Personal adornment might sound trivial compared to hunting mammoths, but it marks a profound shift. When you start decorating your body, you are sending messages without words. Color, pattern, and jewelry tell others who you are and where you belong. Married or single, healer or hunter, member of this group and not that one. Those beads and pendants may have carried stories too. A shell from the coast worn by someone who lived far inland meant trade or travel or a memory of a long journey. A tooth from a dangerous animal might be a trophy, a reminder that you faced fear and survived. Red ochre in particular appears again and again in burials. Bodies dusted with red, graves lined with pigment. Maybe it symbolized blood or life or the setting sun. Maybe it was meant to protect the dead on their journey or make them visible to spirits. Whatever it meant something, which is more than can be said for most modern fashion trends. By the time you reach about 35,000 years ago, this symbolic world becomes even richer. Now it is not only beads and paint and animal images. People begin carving the human form itself. The Venus figurines, small, often handheld sculptures carved from bone, ivory, or stone. They share a similar style across huge distances, from France to Siberia. Many have exaggerated breasts, hips, and bellies. Faces are often minimal or absent. Arms and feet may be barely indicated. The focus is on bodies that look pregnant, fertile, abundant. What were they? Some researchers think they were fertility charms held by women as a kind of hope for healthy children. Others suggest they were representations of a mother goddess, an early form of deity that embodied birth, nourishment, and the cycles of life and death. There is even a theory that some were self-portraits carved by pregnant women looking down at their own bodies, seeing their belly, hips, and breasts, but not their face. We cannot be sure. But whatever their exact purpose, these figures show something crucial. People were thinking about themselves symbolically. Not just, that is a woman, but this small object stands for something bigger. Womanhood, motherhood, life itself. Which was a remarkably sophisticated leap for a species that had only recently stopped hitting rocks together to see what happened. And that symbolic thinking did not stop with bodies and animals. It reached up to the sky. There are hints, just hints, that some early humans were paying careful attention to the stars. At a few sites, carved bones and stones show series of notches that may match the phases of the moon or seasonal events like migrations and plant ripenings. Certain animal images in caves appear clustered in ways that some researchers argue line up with star patterns seen at particular times of year. These interpretations are still debated, but it would not be surprising. If your survival depended on remembering when the herds moved, when the salmon ran, when certain plants became edible, you would watch the sky. You would notice patterns. Eventually, you might begin to think the sky itself was a kind of giant story written just for you. And if the sky tells stories, then maybe the animals do too. For hunter-gatherer peoples around the world, animals are rarely seen as mere meat. They are persons of a different kind. Teachers, tricksters, guardians. The bear that walks on two legs, the raven who steals the sun, the antelope that gave humans fire. These stories are not just entertainment. They are moral lessons, ecological knowledge, maps of the landscape woven into memory. Your Paleolithic ancestors almost certainly saw the world this way. When they painted a running horse on a cave wall, they may not have been drawing a horse. They may have been invoking a spirit that moves like a horse, thinks like a horse, sees the world from a horse's height. To offend that spirit might mean bad hunting for years. To honor it might bring abundance. The result is a world where everything feels alive with meaning. Rocks, rivers, trees, animals, clouds, stars, all beings, all with stories and intentions. And in that world, special people would emerge. The ones who dreamed vividly, who noticed patterns no one else saw, who could calm a panicked child or soothe someone in pain with words and songs. These might become the shamans, or whatever your ancestors called them. Imagine a night near the fire. The day's work is done. People sit in a loose circle, some mending nets, others half asleep. The shaman, or storyteller, the singer, the one who walks between worlds, begins. A drum starts, maybe nothing more than stretched hide over a frame or a hollow log struck with a stick. The beat begins slow, heart-like, then faster. Voices rise, feet start to tap. The group's breathing unconsciously synchronizes. After a while, you are not just listening to the rhythm, you are inside it. Music is one of the oldest human technologies we know. Bone flutes made from the wing bones of birds, hollowed-out reindeer antlers played like wind instruments. Simple percussion that would leave no trace in the archaeological record, but are almost certainly as old as language itself. In the flickering firelight, rhythm and melody do something extraordinary. They dissolve the boundaries between individuals. When everyone moves in time, sings the same phrase, claps on the same beat, the group becomes a single organism for a while. Fear contracts. Time stretches. People enter shared trance states, mild or deep, without needing any plants or substances, just breath and sound and movement. In those moments, the stories about animal spirits and ancestors and journeys to other realms are not just tales. They feel real, because you are experiencing something that is, in fact, real. A different mode of consciousness. A different way of being. A mind in a body surrounded by other minds and bodies doing the same thing. That is the social function of early spirituality. It is not only about explaining thunderstorms or what happens after you die. It is about welding small, fragile groups of humans into something strong enough to survive. Shared rituals, shared symbols, shared songs. They are the glue that holds the band together when food is scarce and danger is near. And when you put all of this together, the deep cave art, the beads and ochre, the carved figurines, the abstract marks, the music and trance, you get a picture of early humans that is very different from the old caricature of brutish cavemen. By day, they tracked animals, knapped stone, dug roots, watched the weather. By night, They stepped into a different world. A world where the dead might listen, where the sky might speak, where animals had secret names and mountains remembered. They carried heavy spears and sharp tools, but they also carried invisible things, myths, songs, rules, taboos, dreams. And when the fire finally burned low and the last stories ended, when the ochre-stained hands were wiped clean on hides, when the drums went silent and people stretched out on beds of grass and skins, they fell asleep in a universe they had helped to create. A universe of meaning layered gently over the raw facts of cold hunger and danger. While they slept, the painted herds waited in the dark tunnels underground. The beads rested against sleeping skin. The Venus figurine lay beside someone's head or tucked inside a pouch with other small treasures. Above them the stars turned slowly, whether anyone watched or not. By morning, the practical work of survival would begin again. But that inner life, the songs, the symbols, the sense of hidden forces moving through everything, never really stopped. It is still with us. Only now, instead of torchlight on limestone, we use screens in the dark. Instead of ochre on skin, we use digital avatars and fashion brands. Instead of carved ivory figurines, we have icons and logos and characters that mean far more to us than their physical substance. The tools have changed. The wiring underneath has not. Chapter 10. Concerning fires, stories, and the important matter of not being eaten during the night. By late afternoon, the light was changing in that subtle, slightly theatrical way the universe has when it wants to remind everyone that time is, in fact, still moving. Shadows stretched longer across the land. Colours began to drain from the landscape, and the temperature dropped faster than you would expect from a planet that had not yet invented central heating. For Paleolithic people, this was not just a pretty sunset. It was a signal, a quiet alarm clock telling everyone, whatever you still need to do, finish it now. The open landscape that felt manageable and familiar in daylight became something very different in the dark. Depth perception collapsed. Predators that had spent the day hidden in shade started to move. So your ancestors began to contract their world, pulling everything inward, drawing all activity toward the one thing that had defined human evenings for at least hundreds of thousands of years: fire. Not every band had fire all the time. There were probably still groups that lost it occasionally, or went without it during long journeys. But for most late Paleolithic communities, fire was as central to the evening as gravity is to your body right now. It was not just a tool, it was a boundary line, inside the circle of light and warmth, us, outside it, everything else. A remarkably effective arrangement, all things considered. As the sun sank, people drifted back toward camp, toward that flickering center. Gatherers returned with armloads of wood, bundles of plants, maybe a few surprise finds. Eggs, honey, shellfish. Hunters straggled in later, sometimes triumphant with meat, sometimes empty-handed and quiet. Children who had spent the day in a wild swarm of games and experiments slowly tightened their radius, pulled in by the same invisible gravity that keeps planets in orbit and small humans near warm lights. The noise level shifted. Daytime work was all scraping, chopping, calling out across distances. Evening was more contained. You heard the crackle of new wood being added, the soft thud of someone hammering one last flake off a stone tool, the muted murmur of voices as people settled into the glow. Before anyone truly rested, though, there was one more job that mattered as much as food: building a place to sleep. Beds sound like a luxury, but they were really a survival technology. The ground is cold. It is damp. It is full of insects, parasites, and heat-sucking stone. Lie straight on it night after night and your body pays the price. So your ancestors learned to build barriers between themselves and the earth. Archaeologists have found traces of ancient bedding, compressed layers of grasses, leaves, and aromatic plants laid down in thick mats, sometimes renewed over and over in the same spot. Think of it as a low-tech mattress. First, someone cleared the worst of the stones and debris. Then they laid down a base of dry material. Grass, reeds, leaves, anything that trapped air and shed water. On top of that, softer plants or moss. Then, if they had them, animal skins, hides from deer or antelope, hair side up for insulation, flesh side in for durability. It was not individually owned furniture. Sleeping spots followed a social map. Parents near children. Elders placed where they were easiest to assist and protect. People with tense relationships, maybe not right next to each other. Over time, everyone knew exactly where they belonged when night came. These arrangements revealed status, alliances, and affections without anyone having to say a word. A system considerably more elegant than most modern seating plans. And while all this quiet bed building was happening at the edge of camp, something more dramatic was happening at the center. The evening meal. If you imagine early humans constantly chewing all day like grazing animals, the evidence does not really support that. For many groups, the largest and most reliable meal of the day seemed to cluster around nightfall. During daylight, people might snack on a handful of berries here, a cracked bone for marrow there, a few nuts or roasted tubers on the go. But the full accounting of the day's success, especially when there was meat involved, tended to happen in the evening around the fire. Food was not just eaten, it was transformed. Meat got roasted or gently boiled in skin bags or bark containers. Bones were split for fat-rich marrow. Organs were cooked quickly before they spoiled. Plant foods were pounded, peeled, ground, leached of toxins. Someone tossed roots into the ashes. Someone else turned skewers of meat. Another person kept the fire at exactly the right intensity, adding logs at just the right time. This was not random chaos. It was a practiced choreography, and the distribution of that food was itself a social performance. Who got the first piece? Who got the best cuts? Did the successful hunter keep most of the meat, or did it get divided according to long-standing custom? Elders first, small children next, then everyone else. Different groups probably did this differently, but almost all of them understood one basic truth. You do not survive long in a foraging society if you are selfish at the big meal. So the evening became a living lesson in generosity and memory. People noticed who shared and who hoarded, who made sure the child on the far side of the fire got a piece of liver or fat, and who pretended not to see. These choices sank deep. In a world with no written laws, these were the behaviors that shaped your reputation and determined who would help you when it was your turn to be unlucky. While hands were busy, mouths were too. Firelit conversations were where human social life thickened. During the day, communication was often practical and shouted across distance. "Over here! Watch out! Try this way!" At night, the volume dropped and the content changed. People debriefed the day. A hunter quietly explained how the antelope bolted faster than expected. A gatherer laughed about the time she tipped over an entire basket of berries. Someone brought up a minor conflict from earlier, a harsh word, a broken tool, and the group smoothed it over while chewing, because carrying that tension into tomorrow could be dangerous. There was planning too. When to move camp. Who would scout that distant ridge tomorrow? Whether to follow the reindeer herds north or stay near the river a little longer. These were not formal councils, but patterns emerged. Some people spoke more, others listened and nodded, influencing the flow with a single quiet remark. Children absorbed all of this, learning not just facts about animals and plants, but how decisions were made, what counted as persuasive, when to speak and when to stay silent. And then, once stomachs were full and the sharp edge of hunger was gone, the tone changed again. Someone might start with a familiar tale about the time an ancestor killed a monstrous lion, or when the river rose so high it carried away half the camp. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were memory storage. In a world without writing, stories carried maps. Which valley had the bitter-tasting roots that were safe to eat only if boiled twice? Which rocky outcrop hid flint suitable for blades? Where the dangerous spirits, or in practical terms, sudden storms and flash floods, liked to dwell. Wrapped around these facts were layers of myth, speculation, outright invention. Did people embellish? Absolutely. But the exaggerations helped make critical information unforgettable. Under that same firelight, another listener might add a different kind of story, one that reached up instead of out, because above them was the same sky you see now, if you step away from city lights. A sky so full of stars it looked almost crowded, streaked occasionally with the ghostly band of the Milky Way, pierced by the sudden scratch of a meteor. We cannot know the first moment a human looked up and wondered, "What is that?" But it would be strange if no one ever did. Long before constellations had names we recognize, people were probably tracing shapes with their fingers, connecting stars into animals, ancestors, paths. Maybe they decided a particular bright star was the eye of a giant creature watching over them, or that the Milky Way was the path taken by souls after death, or that the changing phases of the moon marked the moods of a powerful being whose favor you wanted to keep. None of this leaves fossils, but the human grain has not changed that much. Give people time, a dark sky, and the need to explain a dangerous world, and they will invent stories. Those stories would shape behavior, when to travel, when to attempt risky hunts. Slowly, night after night, a cosmic calendar might have formed in their minds, stitched together from light points no one could touch, but everyone could see. But while eyes were turned upward and thoughts wandered far, the body was still here, in a very real and risky place. Night in the Paleolithic world was not safe. Beyond the ring of firelight, predators moved: hyenas, lions, leopards, wolves. In some regions they smelled the meat, heard the voices, sensed the heat. Most nights, the fire itself and the concentrated human presence were enough of a deterrent, but not always. There were fossil sites where human bones bore the unmistakable damage of carnivore teeth. Caves that showed layered occupancy. Humans one season, big cats the next, so someone always stayed half awake. Vigilance became a rotating duty. Some people were natural light sleepers. Others took turns, waking to toss on more wood, listening for the wrong kind of rustle in the grass. The camp was arranged to slow anything that approached. The densest brush cleared away, thorny branches piled at key access points, sleeping spots clustered so that if one person startled awake, others could be roused in seconds. And in many late Paleolithic camps there was another set of eyes and ears sharing this watch: dogs, or at least the animals that would soon become dogs. By around 40,000 years ago, the process of domestication seemed to have been underway in some places. Wolves that were a little more tolerant of humans, a little less fearful, a little more willing to hang around the edges of camp, scavenging bones and scraps. Over generations, those slightly tamer wolves were tolerated in turn, even encouraged. They were noisy when strangers approached. They smelled predators before you did. They followed tracks. They could help you hunt. At night, they earned their place again and again. Curled at the edge of the firelight, or even pressed against human bodies on the bedding, they added warmth. Their thick fur was a living blanket, especially for children. Their ears twitched at faint sounds no human would notice. A growl, a raised head, a sudden bark. They were an early warning system, wired directly into your nervous system. Once you began to rely on that, Life without them started to feel more dangerous. So you had this layered watchfulness, the humans drifting towards sleep, the half-awake adult poking at the embers, the not yet fully domesticated dogs shifting and sniffing the wind. Together, they created a margin of safety in a world that never fully slept. Gradually, conversations thinned out. The fire dropped from bright flame to glowing coals, the harsh oranges softening into deep reds. Someone added one last log, not for cooking now, but to keep the cold at bay until morning. Sparks rose and vanished into the darkness, briefly imitating the stars above before going out. People found their places on the bedding. Children wedged themselves between adults, heads tucked against warm shoulders. An elder pulled a hide-up around their neck, hands folded under their cheek. A hunter, sore and satisfied, stretched out on his side facing the fire, one arm draped loosely over the dog that had decided to sleep there tonight. The sounds of night settled into layers. Nearby, the crack and sigh of the fire, the soft rhythm of breathing, the occasional murmur from someone caught in a dream. A little further off, the rustle of small animals, the distant call of a night bird. Farther still, the long, eerie whoop of hyenas, the deep, chesty roar of a lion declaring territory. These distant threats were terrifying, but also familiar, woven into the background of every childhood. People learned to distinguish danger by sound. The difference between a hunting roar and a frustrated one, between a curious rustle and an approaching charge. Under all that, the sky kept turning. Stars wheeled slowly toward the horizon. The moon climbed or sank depending on its phase. Clouds passed, sometimes covering the light, sometimes revealing more. Some members of your little band fell asleep quickly, exhaustion winning over anxiety. Others lingered in that liminal space, neither fully awake nor fully gone, thoughts wandering between the day's memories and whatever half-formed images drifted in from the fire and the stars. Maybe they replayed a close call from the hunt. Maybe they thought of the child they lost last winter, imagining them among those distant lights. Maybe they just listened to the breathing of the people they loved and felt, for a moment, something like gratitude. Eventually, even the last watchers drifted inward. The fire slumped into a bed of shimmering coals. The dogs settled their heads on their paws. For a few hours, this tiny cluster of humans was as vulnerable as they would ever be. Eyes closed, weapons out of reach, minds in other worlds. And yet, in another sense, they had never been safer. They were wrapped in layers of protection. They had built themselves knowledge of where to camp and where not, to a carefully maintained firebeds that kept the cold ground at bay. A circle of kin who would wake if one person cried out the warning growl of an animal that chose, for reasons it did not fully understand, to live alongside them. This is what a day in the life ultimately led to. Not just survival, not just constant struggle, but a nightly return to a shared center, to warmth, to story, to the faint but persistent feeling that for all the dangers, this small circle of light in the dark was enough, at least until morning came again. Chapter 11. What we can learn from our ancestors, or why progress might not be quite as straightforward as previously advertised. So after all of this, what did early humans actually do all day? They worked. They walked miles to find roots and berries. They hauled meat back to camp when the hunt succeeded. They shaped stone until their hands ached. They mended tools and clothing. They fed and taught children. They kept the fire alive. They stayed watchful for teeth and claws glowing at the edge of the dark. But that was not all they did. They also sat. They stared into the flames and did nothing at all. They watched clouds drift over hills and lines of migrating animals pass along the horizon. They told stories so slowly that a single tale might last several evenings. They played, not just the children but the adults too, in mock fights, little contests, teasing games with pebbles and sticks and bones. They sang. They traced patterns on cave walls and on their own skin. They rested. Their lives were hard, but not in the way we often imagine. Not a non-stop scramble from dawn to dusk, but pulses of effort and long stretches of low, quiet time. A few hours of intense work, then a lot of simply being together, moving with the seasons, moving with the light. That balance is the part we tend to forget, because here we are with machines that do our grinding and lifting for us, with lights that turn night into day, with more information in our pockets than any hunter-gatherer could have imagined. And yet somehow many of us end up with less true leisure than they had, less unstructured time, fewer evenings where we simply sit and watch the world without checking a clock. The irony is deep. We built tools to free our time and then filled that time back up with noise. Your Paleolithic ancestors never scrolled. They never answered emails by firelight. When the sun went down, there were only a few options: talk, listen, make, dream, or sleep. Their attention belonged to the people around them, to the flames in front of them, to the stars overhead. But if you strip away the technology, the basic things that mattered then still matter now. Community. The circle of people who know your stories, who would share their last scrap of dried meat with you, who would stand beside you when the hyenas came too close. Today, that might be family, friends, or an online community. The shape has changed, but the need has not. Our nervous systems are still calibrated for small groups around a shared task, a shared meal, a shared joke. Creativity. The first carved bone pendant, the first handprint on stone, the first rhythm tapped on a log. None of it helped catch more antelope. But it made life richer. It turned bare survival into a story worth telling. That impulse to make something unnecessary and beautiful is still one of the most human things we do. Nature. For almost all of our history, we woke and slept with the light. We learned the seasons by heart. We could read a landscape the way we now read text. Even if you live in a city, a part of your brain still quiets when you hear rain on a window, or wind in trees, or waves hitting shore. Those sounds are older than language, older than Homo sapiens. Purpose. Early humans did not have 5-year plans, but they had reasons to get up, feed the children, help the group, keep the fire alive one more night. Meaning was woven into daily tasks. Our purposes may be more abstract now, but underneath the same question is always there. Who am I doing this for, and why? When we look back at their days, at the walking, the watching, the talking, the work broken up by laughter and silence, what we see is not a lost world we can never touch again. We see a template, a reminder that a good human day has a certain rhythm, effort and ease, noise and quiet, togetherness and a little solitude. As you lie here listening, you are already doing something profoundly ancient. You are letting the day end. You are stepping away from the hunt of emails and notifications and back toward the fire. If you have enjoyed this slow journey into the past, you can gently tap like so. The algorithm spirits know to show you more. You can leave a comment if you would like. Maybe tell us where in the world you are listening from. Which landscape is outside your own camp tonight? Desert, forest, city lights, mountain air. It all becomes part of this extended circle. If you want to walk with us regularly through these quiet corners of history, you can subscribe so you do not miss the next story. And if you feel moved to support the channel in a deeper way, there is the option to join as a member here on YouTube. That helps us make more of these long, gentle explorations. It is completely optional. Watching, listening, and resting with us is already more than enough. For now, you do not need to do anything at all. Just imagine this. The fire in your ancestors' camp has burned down to deep, steady coals. Most of the group is already asleep, curled under furs, breath slow and even. Someone adds one last piece of wood, more out of habit than necessity. Above them, above you, the same moon drifts across the sky. The same constellations look down, slightly shifted by time, but still recognizably themselves. 40,000 years ago, a child blinked up at those stars, fighting sleep for one more story. Someone reached over, smoothed their hair, promised that the hunt could wait until morning. Tonight you share that same human need to stop, to be safe, to let the mind loosen its grip on the day. The hunt can wait until morning. The world can wait until morning. For now, you can rest under the same ancient sky,